that you can learn from this. It's educational, it's emotional for those of us who were there. And I want to acknowledge Jack Joyce. Jack Joyce is from South Boston, and I'm from Roxbury. And we used to battle when we were young, but we met in Vietnam and became buddies. And the Vietnamese didn't care if we were from Roxbury or South Boston. They were trying to kill both of us. So Jack, could you please stand?
For those of you who are not familiar with Ken Burns and Lynn Novick, we are very happy that you've joined us tonight to experience the work of two of America's finest documentary filmmakers. Ken and Lynn have worked together on some of the most acclaimed documentaries ever made, including Jazz and The War, their look at World War II. We're grateful that he has made public television his production home. And through WGBH, we are thrilled to be able to share his enormous talent with all of you. Please join me in welcoming my friend and colleague, Ken Burns.
On behalf of Lynn Novick, who is my co-director, we were interested. More than 10 years ago, we decided to do this project because we saw the Vietnam War as the most important event in American history since the Second World War. It's also something that we've chosen a kind of convenient amnesia, or at least we find ourselves in our own individual hardened silos, unable to get out of fixed positions, conventional wisdom, and superficial understanding of it. And we hope by telling a very broad perspective about the war that includes not only more than 50 Americans from every possible stripe and walk of life, from Gold Star mothers and reporters and policy wonks in the Pentagon and anti-war demonstrators to Marines and Army men by the severals, and POWs and doctors and nurses and pilots. You get a complete picture of, I think, the American dimension to this. But also we've interviewed North Vietnamese soldiers and civilians and Viet Cong guerrillas and South Vietnamese soldiers and South Vietnamese civilians and South Vietnamese protesters and South Vietnamese diplomats. They had a very complex and open society before that country disappeared. And what we want to do is try to tell a complete story as much as we can.
It was fought in the North and in the South, in the air and on the ground. It was fought in the White House and in the halls of Congress, in America's streets and colleges and living rooms. And we continue to ask, what happened? The Vietnam War.
In the spring of 1919, as the victorious Allied powers met in Paris to rebuild a world shattered by the Great War, President Woodrow Wilson headed the American delegation, housed in the Hotel Crillon. One day, a tall, slender, 29-year-old man appeared with a petition for the president he and other Vietnamese nationalists had written. Inspired by Wilson's declaration that the interests of colonial peoples should be given equal weight with those of their European rulers, the man was asking that this principle be applied to his homeland. The president's secretary promised to show it to Wilson, but there is no evidence that he ever did. His name was Win Tat Tan, but he was now living under an alias, Win Ai Quoc, Win the Patriot. During his long, shadowy career, he would adopt some 70 different pseudonyms, finally settling on the most enlightened one, Ho Chi Minh.
Thì chiều, tối chừng 5 giờ, có một chiếc máy bay bay trên đầu chúng tôi, ngay chỉ huy sở của trung đoàn á. Thì đồng chí trung đoàn trưởng của chúng tôi nói bắn rơi không? Nó nói chắc rơi. Thì 1 phút sau, cái máy bay bị bắn cháy.
All of a sudden, you could see the tracers come out of the plantation, hit the helicopter, and crash. We were ordered to go down and retrieve the remains the following morning.
Tôi lại chỗ cái máy bay rơi, thì tôi thấy 4 cái người Mỹ chết. Lúc đó cũng chưa hiểu cái quan trọng của tính mạng của các cố vấn Mỹ.
Then commanding officer from Saigon told the battalion, you have to come in and get all 4 American servicemen body.
4 cố vấn Mỹ thì phải đưa tiểu đoàn vô cứu rồi.
The lead company got to the remains and then was pounced on and mauled badly.
12 South Vietnamese Marines from Tuan's unit were killed getting to the downed helicopter. Their comrades wrapped them in ponchos and laid them out next to the dead Americans.
Tôi đã chứng kiến là phía bên Mỹ người ta mất. Mặc dầu ngôn ngữ tôi không biết, nhưng mà họ vẫn khóc, họ vẫn điều dìu với nhau. Khi họ bị thương á, họ cũng kè với nhau, rồi họ cũng khiêng sát với nhau, mà họ khóc rất nức nở. Rồi tôi đã chứng kiến cái đó thì tôi nghĩ rằng người Mỹ cũng như người Việt của chúng tôi thôi, cũng có cái tình thương bao la như thế, nhưng mà họ vẫn đùm bọc với nhau. Và cái đó là cái mà làm cho tôi suy nghĩ.
Most Americans understood little about Indochina, rarely knew anyone actually involved in the fighting, saw no reason to question the government's assertion that the United States had vital interests 8,000 miles from home. Still, there was a small but growing number of people who had begun to oppose the war for any number of reasons, because they thought it unjust or immoral, believed it was unconstitutional, or simply not in the national interest.
Oh, I marched to the Battle of New Orleans.
2 weeks after the Marines landed at Da Nang, members of the University of Michigan faculty organized a night-long discussion between professors and some 3,000 students about the escalation of the war.
The demonstration was called a teach-in because the idea originated with a group of university professors. What do you hope to accomplish?
I'd like to open up communication between people and the government, because I believe that they're not telling us what is going on, and the people have a right to know, and we have the right to tell the government what we think.
Good morning, Mr. President.
Hi, Jack.
We need guidance this morning, sir.
Guidance? Is that all you want?
Yes, sir.
No quotation?
That's right.
No attribution? No connection?
That's right.
Give it absolutely none.
Absolutely.
Your press is lying like drunken sailors every day. First thing I waked up this morning was trying to figure out, after seeing CBS, watching the networks, reading the morning papers, was how can we win, possibly win and survive as a nation and have to fight the press's lies.
Yes, sir.
I'm trying to protect my country and they all whipping me. Not a son of a bitch said a word about Ho Chi Minh. They talk about us bombing. Yet these sons of bitches come in and bomb our embassy, and 19 of them try to raid on. All 19 get killed. And yet they blame the embassy. I don't understand it. We think we've killed 20,000. We think we've lost 400. We think that, of course, it's bad to lose anybody, any one of the 400. But we think that the good Lord has been so good to us that it is a major, dramatic victory. And I think what would have happened if I'd lost 20,000 and they'd lost 400? I ask you that.
I was brought up to believe that the communists were people who would destroy the family, destroy religion, and people who had no allegiance to our country, but to international communism. My mother would describe them as đầu trâu mặt ngựa, which means that these are people with the head of a water buffalo and the face of a horse, meaning that they were subhumans and they were brutal. But on the other hand, I thought they also include people like my sister Tang and a lot of my cousins. I couldn't quite reconcile the two images. But of the two, I think the other image was much stronger because I was so scared of them. I thought, these people must be really, really horrible people. That was the frame of mind I had when I started doing research into the communist movement.
Duong Von Mai was the daughter of an official in the South Vietnamese government and was now married to an American, David Elliott. Back in 1964, she had gone to work for the Rand Corporation in Saigon. The think tank had been commissioned by Robert McNamara to do a study of enemy prisoners to find out who are the Viet Cong and what makes them tick.
I remember my first interview. I was by myself. I was very young, and I was going to this pretty grim prison to interview this high-ranking cadre who had been captured. I went in thinking I'm going to meet this beast, you know, this guy with the head of a water buffalo and the face of a horse. He walked in and he was very surprised to see me, and just as surprised as I was to see him. Here was a man who had devoted all his life to fight for what he called a just cause, to free his country of foreign domination, to reunify the country under just government. So he really totally believed in it, to the point that he sacrificed his whole life to this cause. So I left, I was very impressed with him.
When the Rand report was presented to McNamara's top deputies at the Pentagon, describing the Viet Cong as a dedicated enemy that could only be defeated at enormous cost, one senior official said, "If what you say is true, we're fighting on the wrong side, the side that's going to lose this war."
I never considered the Vietnamese our enemy. They had never done anything to threaten the security of the United States. They were off 10,000 miles away, minding their own business. And we went there to their country, told them what kind of government we wanted them to have.
Well, when I see the war protesters, I react on a couple of levels. Intellectually, I certainly understand their right to the freedom of speech, but I will tell you that when I see them waving NLF flags, the enemy that I and my friends had to fight, and some of my friends had to die fighting, that doesn't sit very well with me.
On November 15th, 1969, 500,000 citizens turned out against the war in Washington again. This time, buses provided an impenetrable wall around the White House. President Nixon claimed he was too busy watching football on television to pay attention. But he did suggest that Army helicopters might be used to blow out the marchers' candles. Hundreds of thousands of others demonstrated in San Francisco and New York.
We have it in our power to prove to our friends in the world that America's sense of responsibility remains the world's greatest single hope of peace. And generations in the future will look back at this difficult, trying time in America's history, and they will be proud that we demonstrated that we had the courage and the character of a great people.
Dr. Kissinger?
Yeah, Mr. President. Yeah, hi, Henry. This was the best speech you've delivered since you've been in office.
Yeah. I'll tell you one thing. This little speech was a work of art. I mean, I know a little something about speech writing, and it was no act, because no actor could do it. No actor in Hollywood could have done that well. I thought that was done well, didn't you think?
First of all, no actor could have written it. To begin with, you couldn't have done it unless you had meant it.
Yeah. Yeah. And if it doesn't work, I don't care. I mean, right now, if it doesn't work, then let me say, though, I'm going to find out soon, and then I'm going to turn right so goddamn hard it'll make your head swim. We'll bomb those bastards right off the earth. I really mean it.
You know what? The real heroes are the men that died. 19, 20-year-old high school dropouts. They didn't have escape routes that the elite and the wealthy and the privileged had. And that was unfair. And so they looked upon military services like the weather. You had to go in and you do it. But to see these kids who had the least to gain, there wasn't anything to look forward to. They were going to be rewarded for their service in Vietnam. And yet, their infinite patience, their loyalty to each other, their courage under fire was just phenomenal. And you would ask yourself, how does America produce young men like this?
Soldiers adapt. You go over there with one mindset, you know, and then you adapt. You adapt to the atrocities of war. You adapt to killing, dying, you know. After a while, it doesn't bother you. I should say it doesn't bother you as much. When I first arrived in Vietnam, there were some interesting things that happened, and I questioned some of the Marines. I was made to realize that this is war, and this is what we do. And that stuck in my head. This is war, this is what we do. And after a while, you embrace that. This is war. This is what we do.
Lynn first worked with Ken at Florentine Films on his groundbreaking series, The Civil War, and has earned numerous awards and honors. As part of Lynn's work on the Vietnam War, she traveled to Vietnam 4 times and conducted more than 80 of the interviews in the film. Welcome, Lynn Novick. And we're also particularly honored to have with us tonight Dr. Roger Harris, who you saw in the film clips. Dr. Harris is a native of Roxbury and has devoted his 40-year career in education to Boston schools. And he began by attending them. He earned his bachelor's degree at Boston University, his master's degree at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, and his doctorate at Boston College. He recently retired as superintendent and CEO of the Boston Renaissance Charter Public Schools. For more than a decade, Dr. Harris has served as a mentor principal to the Harvard Graduate School of Education. He served 3 years of active duty with the United States Marine Corps, including a 13-month tour of duty with a combat unit in Vietnam. Let me say, Dr. Harris, on behalf of all of us, thank you for your service. And to moderate our discussion this evening, we're fortunate to have the best conversationalists in the city of Boston, WGBH's own Jim Braude and Margery Eagan, hosts of the very popular Boston Public Radio on 89.7 FM.
Jim doesn't often let me talk much, never mind talk first. But I think you'll forgive me tonight when I say that we are both honored to be on the stage tonight with Ken Burns, Roger Harris, and Lynn Novick to be a part of this tonight. And I want to start by asking Ken, you touched on this before in your opening remarks, and the excerpts we saw tonight touched on it too. But just for the basics, why Vietnam, and what were you hoping to achieve?
Well, you know, the latter is much easier than the former. Lynn and I had worked together making a film on the history of the Second World War, and it consumed the first 7 years of this new century. And as we were finishing in late 2006, looking ahead to the broadcast in 2007, I turned to her and said, we have to do Vietnam. It was something we'd talked about. Many of us at Florentine Films had talked about over the years, an idea in our head. But it sort of seemed, after wrestling to the ground, or trying to wrestle to the ground, the greatest cataclysm in human history, the Second World War, you began to understand how radically different Vietnam was, how significant it was, as I said before, in our history. And I think what we also felt is that there had been so few stories about the war that had felt in any way complete. I grew up during this period. I had a high draft number. I lived on a college campus. My father was an academic. The war was a big part of my early childhood, from 10 to 18 when I was eligible for the draft. And I thought I knew something, and what was instantly clear is how little we did know. So I think in many ways, if we could talk about what we wanted to achieve, was just to do a fully dimensional portrait, one that would include the Vietnamese voices, also have a bottom-up thing to take advantage of all of the extraordinary presidential tapes to give you a sense of what was happening intimately in what is traditionally a top-down and rather arm's length thing, the White House, policy decisions in which you can hear the president on one day say one thing and then be admitting the exact opposite in confidence on the tapes. And it's a pretty stunning sort of combination of things. But to get at what we don't often want to get at in war, and particularly what we don't often want to get at in this particular war because of the way it didn't turn out so well for Americans, so we tended to avoid it, was just to try to put our arm around as many aspects of it and finally make battles have meaning within a larger historical and military context, but also understand that those battles are not just arrows on a map, but human lives. And when you get to meet Roger and John Musgrave and Ho Hu Lan at Con Thien, but also in other battles where we triangulate with a South Vietnamese soldier and his American Marine advisor, and with the Viet Cong shooting at him, it makes for a kind of dimensional portrait, and that's what we're looking for. We never had a didactic consideration, you know, we're going to do this and achieve that. We wanted to tell a good story. And, you know, we work in the province of history, which is mostly made up of the word story. And we tried to take this complex, multi-generational, multi-dimensional kind of Russian novel of a thing with lots of characters and try to tell a good story, period, full stop.
Okay, Lynn Novick, it's your turn. So, first of all, J.K. Rowling has nothing on you two. I mean, look at this crowd. The anticipation of these 18 hours is so intense everywhere we travel. It is just spectacular. But you know, about the third hour that I'm watching this, I called Margery the night I was doing about the third hour, Lynn, I'm saying to myself, I guess something that is painfully obvious. You two are the primary source of knowledge of history for the people of this country. Well, I'm so glad you sighed, because my question is, are you aware of, no, you are, I mean, that is just factually true. Are you aware of that burden when you're doing the work that you and your coworkers, and don't be humble, I mean, it is what it is. I'm serious, you aware of that or no?
The two of our esteemed advisors are in this room, the actual experts on this subject, some of them. We had some of the foremost experts on the history of the Vietnam War and American history and culture and Vietnamese history work with us on the film.
Well, I meant your whole team.
So we
right.
presume that we don't know anything, as Ken was saying, and we're trying to take this material and make a story out of it that's digestible and comprehensible to us, first of all, and then to our audience. And we rely on this extraordinary group of scholars. So we are not really waking up every morning thinking about what you said. We're thinking about solving problems as filmmakers, finding people to talk to, understanding their experience, making sense of it, reading the history, talking to our advisors, and then screening the film as we work on it with people who know nothing about it and people who know everything, and trying to make a film that, in fact, is relatable and comprehensible to both or all groups in those categories. So, you know, honestly, we don't think about that much.
Look at the smile on his face. Of
We
course
don't.
he feels the burden.
No, I mean,
no?
Now that being said, you know, the other day we were doing an event with someone who you'll get to know in the film, Merrill McPeak, who was a fighter pilot during the war and eventually became the Air Force Chief of Staff. And he said he thought that, you know, a younger generation doesn't read that much. We've had to read many, many books to try to make sense of this subject. but many people don't read as much as they used to, and that a film like this will actually be their version of history, and that we are aware of that. But I guess I always like to think that what our films also do is generate interest in people then go and read books or go to Vietnam or talk to veterans or find out more about the history from whatever they can access. So it's kind of an entry point more than an end point.
The good thing was, to me, the reason why I was smiling is that the 18 hours just breezed out of your mouth like that was nothing. We live in a country obsessed with kittens and balls of string, and nobody's saying, 18 hours, what are you crazy? I'm reveling in the assumption that everyone will watch 18 hours of something on as tough as the Vietnam War.
Roger Harris, I wanted to ask you, because among the many, many things I learned in watching about Vietnam, I knew that a lot of American vets didn't really want to talk about the war. I didn't know until I listened to some of the Vietnamese soldiers you guys interviewed, both North and South Vietnamese, that a lot of them didn't want to talk about it either. And at one point, when you were interviewed, I think it was in episode 5, when you were in a place near the DMZ that I learned was nicknamed the Dead Marines Zone for so many of the soldiers that died there. You talked about a particularly bad battle, and in the middle of that scene, you said, I don't want to talk about it anymore. So I'm wondering why you decided to talk to Lynn and Ken Burns at all for this film.
Well, before I do, I'd like to first acknowledge any Gold Star families and Vietnam veterans who are in the audience. Could you please stand? Jack Joyce, stand. Jack was with me. I feel blessed, one, to be here and have survived it, but I feel blessed and honored to have been selected to tell my story. But the way it happened, I was invited to share my story by some veterans who are here now, who were with the Boston Veterans Benefits Clearinghouse. I was asked to come down. I was invited to come down, and I met Lynn and Sarah Bostein, and they asked all of us to tell 5 or 6 minutes of our experience in Vietnam. And we didn't know at the time that it was Ken Burns' company, and we didn't know how big it was going to be. And I shared a little bit about my story, and months later I was contacted again. But I have to honestly say that Lynn has a special way of making folks comfortable and allowing you to express or tell your story. And so much of what you saw was because of the relationship and the level of comfort that Lynn had created while we were being interviewed.
Roger, first of all, what do you think of the film?
I think this is the most comprehensive documentary on a war that I've ever seen. I think it not just tells the story of soldiers, but it tells the story of the politics on this side, on the American side, the politics on the Vietnamese side, the fact that it covers 3 or 4 presidents, and you can see and hear the secret tapes, and the war protesters. I've never seen anything as comprehensive as this, and so there are so many lessons that you can learn from this. It's educational, it's emotional for those of us who were there, and I want to acknowledge Jack Joyce. Jack Joyce is from South Boston, and I'm from Roxbury, and we used to battle when we were young, but we met in Vietnam and became buddies. And the Vietnamese didn't care if we were from Roxbury or South Boston. They were trying to kill both of us. So Jack, could you please stand? Oh, man. Yeah.
You know, Lynn, you told us when we were when we met you guys before this, that you were actually back in Vietnam, and you showed a captioned version of this to some of the people who were in your film. What kind of reaction did you get there? And as Margery said, they were also reticent, that whole cadre of people, to talk about what happened, just like the Rogers of the world have been. So what was the reaction?
Well, first, I want to say thank you to WGBH, because we actually did this enormously complicated project of subtitling the entire film in Vietnamese here in Boston at GBH. We brought in some Vietnamese translators, but the physical process of designing the subtitles so that you could read them in Vietnamese was done here, and there's nowhere else in America that we could have done it. So you have an extraordinary resource here. We're very grateful. Because we decided sort of at the last minute-ish to do it, and we weren't sure we could pull it off, and it was only because we were able to do it here. So Ken and I are just sort of speechless in thinking about the fact that the film will stream on PBS with the option of Vietnamese subtitles, and it will be able to be seen in Vietnam because Vietnam has open internet. And it's not controlled by the government. It's privately, the way the internet is here, essentially. And 40 million Vietnamese have access to the internet. So our entire film will be seen. So I went a few weeks ago just to share some clips with the people who were in it and also with some members of the public. And their sense was very similar to Roger, that it's comprehensive, that stories they don't know about themselves and about our experience. And also Vietnamese on the winning side don't know much about people who endured the war on the losing side. And they're very curious about that as well. And they don't talk about it in a sort of personal way. They don't describe the true horrors of the war to themselves. So one of the veterans said that he thought that the film would give the Vietnamese a chance to understand their own humanity and inhumanity, and the same with ours. And that was really a profound experience for them to see it. It was exciting.
One last thing about this. Roger, when you saw men just like you, your age, who'd been on the other side, part of their mission was to get rid of you, yours to get rid of them. And you saw their humanity as Lynn just described it. And at least to me as an outsider, saw them in many ways just like you. What was that like for you?
Seeing them here?
Yes, in the movie.
For me, it was enlightening because for it's been 50 years now, I've wondered what was in their head. Because, to be honest, when I went to Vietnam, when I joined the Marine Corps, I thought I was tough. Then the Marine Corps takes you through this tremendous training that makes you think that you're even tougher. And I thought I was tough. And when I got to Vietnam, the Vietnamese soldiers let me know what tough was. I mean, we used to complain about eating sea rations, and about the conditions that we were in. And these guys, they were trekking with a knee sock full of rice and water, and they were going against, phantom jets and tanks and bombs, and I used to wonder, what motivated them. And it wasn't until I began participating in the editing of this that I got to see and understand the psyche of the Vietnamese soldiers, and I was very impressed. And this whole thing has been moving for me. It's been an educational experience, but it also has been a way of just lifting a lot of things off my head, and I hope it does the same for other veterans. But I also hope that the policymakers who see this realize that they should think 2 or 3 times before they rattle sabers and think about sending other people's children off to fight in wars.
Following up on sending other children off to war, I was astonished watching this film by what the journalists did there too, the footage. I mean, they were inches away, and the one gentleman that was shot, and I'm sure many others were injured. We used to sit and watch on the television news when we were growing up, shots of Vietnam. We don't see that anymore, and I wonder if you've thought about the impact of that on what Americans think about what's going on now.
Well, it's so interesting. We had done World War II, in which the journalists' access was really tightly controlled, and in Vietnam it wasn't. and journalists could go basically anywhere. And it should be noted there about their heroics are so amazing. You'll meet several journalists on the screen, but also that we've been able to interview. And their bravery is unbelievable. And many journalists, hundreds of journalists were killed during the war from all around the world, print journalists and photographers and television cameramen, and that it's an amazing sacrifice. And I think when we go into the inevitable and oft cliched ideas of the lessons of Vietnam, and there are some important ones. We will not blame our warriors again. But another one that the military learned was we're not going to let them have free reign. We're going to embed them. Sounds very sexy and right in there with it, but it means they're surrounded by a scrum. And it's only the resourcefulness of the press that continues to provide us with scoops along the ages. But it's remarkable. The film we made is in large measure because of the photojournalists and the videographers and filmmakers who were able to be there, and then also the extraordinary reporters over time who were able to sort of accrete a sense of what soldiers are seeing, but from a different, perhaps, more nuanced perspective. The soldiers have it, and that's, you want to be your main source of information, and why we brought veterans into our editing room. Their BS meters are as finely tuned as any group of people. I think the scholars that were, as Lynn said, that were so extraordinarily helpful in their particular bailiwick. At one point, when you have a Air Force general telling you that that is not an A4, but not an A3, but an A4, get it right. And he comes back a year later and says, okay, it's the right plane, but you got the wrong sound of that plane. We then realized that why it took a decade, the verisimilitude on all levels was to try to get it right. Just the facts, but also the feelings of it, so that someone like Roger could have something lifted is a pretty important thing for us. And I would extend not just to him and the Vietnam veterans, but to everybody, because this is, as he said, this is war. This is what we do, meaning not just Marines, but all of us do this. And this is, one of the burdens of our species, that it is part of our DNA. It's wired into our hard drive that we will go to war. And you've got to study war. It brings out the worst, of course, but it also reveals the best, the fellowship, the love. Wayne Smith and I were talking about that love that is kind of uniting everything, but you also want to have policymakers firmly aware. When our I'll stop in a second. When our Civil War series came out in the fall of 1990, a month and a half before, Saddam Hussein had invaded Kuwait. And we hadn't been in a war in an awful long time, and Americans were so excited and happy to go to war. Something like 85% of us were really, let's go over there and kick some serious butt. And the Civil War came out, and that enthusiasm diminished instantaneously by about 25% in national polling. And that was just of black and white photographs of Americans killing other Americans. We considered that our best review.
Roger, I know you wanted to say something about that, and then Lynn.
I just wanted to thank Ken and Lynn for the comprehensiveness, because one of the things that I didn't think would make it in the film, and it did, I thought it would end up on the cutting floor, was the reception that I received when I came back home. And it wasn't like the first clip that we saw tonight. And my reception was similar to the reception that many African Americans had when they came home, when I landed at Logan Airport with my uniform on and all the medals on my chest. I couldn't get a taxi cab. 6 taxi cabs went right by me, and the state troopers had to step out and stop the taxi and tell them to take me. And the taxi driver looked up at both of us, and he said, "But I don't want to go to Roxbury." And I remember thinking, how does he know I live in Roxbury? And then I realized he didn't see Marine, he saw nigger, and niggers live in Roxbury. And after going through all that, to come back here and not be able to get a cab, I appreciate the fact that you put that in, and I just want to thank you for that.
There's zero chance that we would have not put that in the film. It's extraordinarily important to help our audience understand what's happening in America and what's happening in Vietnam and the interrelationships, not to mention that they care about you and they see what happens to you. It's extremely important, and thank you for telling us the story. It's not easy to tell. I just wanted to say one more thing about the media, because it's just interesting to think about how much can the civilian population take of seeing the images of war, you know? And our leaders were very aware of that. The North Vietnamese were very aware of that, so they tightly controlled what images were shown to their public, and they were not really allowed to see, or they did not allow the representation of their own soldiers severely wounded or killed. So they just kept a very tight lid on what the people saw, and morale stayed very high throughout the entire war for a variety of reasons, but that's not a small part of it. And the sort of frustration of our leaders' ability to control the narrative, because the free press that we had, we think is an important part of the story, and it's a constant tension in the series and seemed extremely relevant today.
You know, when I'm listening to Roger, Ken, you know, your epitaph, Ken, is probably going to be, here lies Ken Burns. He made obscure historians famous, and famous historians even more famous. But you didn't take that approach here. And by the way, one of the reasons this thing is so, well, we've both seen about 5 hours of it, is just so compelling, is because it is all first-person accounts.
You know, you can't do that with the Civil War. It has a lot of first-person accounts, but you can't interview Lincoln and Jefferson Davis. But we did, you know, there was an interplay of voices. I mean, this film reminds me more of the Civil War than any other film we've made.
Why?
Because of the sense of oppositional stuff, learning from what's going on in civilian life, what's going on with, you know, the soldiers on both sides and that sort of thing, and the kind of equality of perspective that we were trying to achieve in both films. But we made a decision going into the World War II film that there would be nobody that was an expert unless accidentally they all they were also combat soldiers. And so we didn't have any, except the two that were accidentally experts but happened to have served in combat. Here, it was super important not to do this. But Lynn, I just do want to say that Lynn is absolutely right. We benefited from extraordinary scholarship that has taken place in the last 42 years since the fall of Saigon. Amazing scholarship that upends the conventional wisdom and the superficial knowledge that I was referring to before. It's really important that we don't constantly think that baseball was invented in Cooperstown, you know? It's just didn't happen that way. The real story is much more interesting, but we're never going to do it. In Vietnam, it's important to let go of our baggage. I don't know. This has been a multi-around-the-world flight for me with, you know, hundreds of stops, and I lost my baggage in the first flight. And that was one of the best things that happened. And a lot of it had to do with the scholars are doing. Having said that, we were not interested in any Monday morning quarterbacking. None. And so what you have here are people who experience these things, and they might be a policy wonk at the Pentagon, or it might be a demonstrator, or even a deserter, or a Gold Star family, or some such thing, but it's mainly made up of Marines and Army guys and NVA guys and Viet Cong guys and gals.
Can I broach a personal thing with you, if you don't mind? I did a little research on you too, and I saw that you were in the final.
This is not the boxers or briefs question.
No, actually, I'm going to get to that in a second. It's funny you should say. I did a little research. You were in the fourth lottery. Were you not in the final lottery?
Yeah, yes.
And you got a high number.
Yeah.
I was in the first lottery, and I don't talk about this either, and I got a low number. And I was not happy about it, but I was ready to serve. I was really not happy about it, and I was scared out of my mind. And I was declared medically unfit to serve. In the intervening years, I haven't felt guilt much for that. I did nothing wrong. I mean, it was all legit. I felt colossal guilt when I watched this movie, when I listened to you, and when I listened to some of the Vietnamese fighters. Do you feel, I mean, you didn't do anything wrong either. You got a high number. Did you feel guilt as you made this film that he served and 58,000 Americans died, 2 million Vietnamese, and our lives were not at risk?
I'm not as good a person as you are, Jim.
Well,
I didn't.
I wouldn't go that far.
I didn't. Spoken from experience. You know, I didn't. I felt extraordinary relief. I still feel relief. I know I came across these half-hearted letters I were trying to assemble and write myself in search of a potential, though actually non-existent, CO that I was hoping might forestall an ultimate decision of jail or leaving. And that didn't happen. But I do know that there is something that I am attracted to in war and combat. And it's been there in my DNA since I was a little boy. I killed Germans by the dozens every day in my backyard with a Thompson submachine gun. And I played Civil War war games and had a set of stuffed blue and gray soldiers with my brother growing up. I'm fascinated by what happens in war, and there's a moment when Karl Marlantes, the Marine that you meet, said that war is like crack cocaine, that combat is like crack cocaine. And he also adds at another point, he said that we didn't get to be the dominant species on the planet because we're nice. He said that people often complain that the military takes young men and turns them into killing machines, and he said, I'd rather suggest that it's just finishing school. And I think there is, in part of us, a kind of curiosity about it. And in a sense, it is in our film, in the Gold Star Mother, as she reads to her then little boy from Henry V and the St. Crispin Day speech, in which it's implied that men now abed will feel lesser because they had not participated in battle. And that impulse, yours and mine, that are variations on that same human weakness that we haven't evolved from this, it's part of our DNA, is why, for all the reasons that Roger and Lynn have said as well this evening, why we have to continually study war. You know, the romanticization of it, the curiosity of it, the guilt of it, the sense of who we are, the extraordinary sacrifice of it. I mean, you know, that telephone call back to his mom. I mean, that's one of the most amazing things I've ever heard in my life.
I think we're running short of time here, but just...
5 extra minutes, you guys. Is that okay? 5 extra, go ahead.
Based on what you just said, Ken, and I know you've talked about human nature not changing and this impulse toward war, that's disheartening. But Roger, you've been through it, and Lynn, you're a woman. Maybe women feel differently about this. I don't know. But one of the things that I found upsetting is the parallels to today and to other wars where the leaders knew that it was going poorly and they lied about it. And in Vietnam, you had the incredible shots of the hundreds of thousands of people in the streets saying, enough already, and the war kept going. So, you know, you wonder whether we ever learn or if this is just the way it's going to go forever. I mean, I don't know, Roger, what do you think?
I'll tell you what I would like to have happen. I spent the last 42 years in schools in Boston, K-12 schools and universities, and I've had the opportunity of working with many students who were gang involved, and I found similarities. When I first got to Vietnam, there's a piece in there where I'm talking with some Marines and asking them about some of the things that were being done, and they said, this is war, this is what we do. 13 years later, I was a principal at a school in Roxbury, and there was a big gang problem in Boston at the time, and these two rival gangs were shooting at each other, and they killed 2 little kids, a 9-year-old boy and an 11-year-old boy was killed across the street from Timothy. And I went out, it was the Highland Street Blackhawks. I went out to talk to the Highland Street Blackhawks. And they said, Mr. Harris, with all due respect, this is the ghetto. This is what we do. And he gave me flashbacks to what I experienced in Vietnam, and I realized that many kids in the inner city are experiencing post-traumatic stress just like soldiers do. And then it caused me to reflect on what happens in American society. All we have to do is think about how we program our kids from the time that they're small. The cartoons are violent. The movies, the shows are violent. Whoever knows the most karate, whoever is the quickest on the draw, whoever kills the most people, whoever is the toughest guy gets the pretty girl. So we program our kids from the time that they're small to be tough, to be violent, to be successful. We have to somehow create a paradigm shift where violence isn't the way to get the pretty girl or the handsome guy. You know, nonviolence has to be the way. And so we have to somehow, and I was talking with someone today about it. In fact, Nancy, man, that's Nancy right there. Nancy's gonna help me develop this paradigm shift. We're gonna start something in this country. We're gonna get a ball rolling where we shift from violence to using peaceful resolution. And hopefully it'll go from the bottom up. So policymakers will have respectful dialogue and respectful communication rather than threaten to shoot rockets and bombs on each other, because it doesn't make any sense. I don't know if I answered your question.
Let me tell you, the most important skill of a moderator is knowing when to end, and that is when to end. Please join us in thanking Ken, Roger, and Lynn for their wonderful work.